Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to the Women's Rights in Mining webinar on sexual gender-based violence in the mining sector. My name is Jennifer Hinton. I am the Uganda country head for Jervois Mining, as well as the head of ESG, Environmental, Social and Governance, as well as an advisor to women's rights in mining. And for those of you who don't know, Women's Rights in Mining is a collaborative effort between NGOs, researchers, government organizations, and we're all working together to secure concrete commitments from key mining stakeholders around the world to share gender concerns. One of the key gender concerns, of course, relates to sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector. We have an excellent panel today, and we look forward to hearing from them and their experiences around the world. I'll refer all of you at the end. We do have some references for everyone to share, and we'll be sharing these slides at the end. But for Women's Rights in Mining, you can go to womenandmining.org. Don't do it right now because we're just beginning. And let's get started. There's me. You can already see me. First of all, can we have the next slide? Next slide, please. Great. So for some of you that are participating, you may not be so familiar with the mining sector, so it's important to distinguish that there are different scales of mining when we talk about women's rights in mining. We have at the left-hand side, at the bottom of the spectrum, in terms of investment, what's called artisanal mining, which can involve everything from hammers, basins, shovels, the most really rudimentary crude mining that you see sometimes or hear about taking places in the world like the Amazon, the Congo, and in actuality, there's well over 30 million artisanal and small scale miners. As you move along the spectrum, you might get a bit more investment, a bit more mechanization, degree of organization, maybe small companies, small enterprises. And then you can move all the way up the spectrum to medium and large scale mining companies. And so we can really literally be talking about someone who may only have a rock to smash another rock, may not have a hammer at the artisanal end of the spectrum, all the way across to large scale mining, where we might be talking about a capital cost investment of $500 million or more. Very high tech, very modern. A lot of work being done right now, say on robotics and automation. The other important thing to look at in this graph is what we do see are the number of people employed. There are a large number of people cumulatively in large scale mining, but say at an operation or site level, you can have artisanal mine sites that maybe have 5 or 8 people, but maybe 5,000 people. Whereas an average large scale mine employs maybe 800 to 1,200 people. What is important to highlight though is women's participation tends to decrease sharply as soon as you move across the spectrum from artisanal to becoming a bit more mechanized and especially formalized and organized. So we do see high rates of women's participation in the less formal end of the spectrum and more poverty-driven aspects of mining. Now this is important. We'll hear about examples of both large-scale and artisanal small-scale mining and some of the issues emerging today. But it's not just about women's direct participation. We're talking about women and men in communities around mines and how they may be affected through sexual and gender-based violence. So next slide, please. Our fantastic speakers today. We have Adriana Eftimi, who's the Senior Operations Officer at the IFC. Hi, Adriana. Good to see you here. Decades of experience in the mining sector and an extensive amount of experience in gender and mining. We have Fatima Valley, an activist at mining affected communities in United in Action, or MACUA, and Women Affected by Mining in Action, WAMUA. So we're looking forward to hearing from Fatima. We have Emmanuel Ankama, National Coordinator of Presbyterian Relief Services and Development, who's going to talk about his experiences tackling gender issues through the Golden Line Project. And we have Sophie Rickard, very exciting, recently launched important study on sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector in Africa. And so we'll give you links to that study, but we'll hear more about that today. Next slide, please. Next slide. I don't know how to toggle the slides. There we go. Okay, before we begin, those of you that are new to Zoom, it's important to know if you have questions, you can see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for our panelists, please be entering those questions and we'll get to them throughout the session, sporadically in between, and have a good conversation at the end. If you want to chat with each other about practical issues, you're having challenges, we see someone raising their hand. Maybe you can use the chat because I'm not facilitated to address things directly. But if you want to talk to each other or share information or address some practical issues, your computer's crashing, etc., I sound like a crazy person, please mention that there. So first off, let's go to Sophie. You've recently conducted this amazing research on SGBV in the mining sector. But before we get into the findings, can you tell us and elaborate what actually constitutes SGBV? And in particular, what does this mean for the mining sector? So we'll hand it over to Sophie.
Thanks so much, Jen. Yes, I have recently worked on a research piece funded by GIZ on SGB in the mining sector, and I just want to credit Lucy Etim, Messiah Wangoka, and Dr. Laura Martins, who also collaborated on that study, of which I'm presenting a few findings today. So in terms of defining SGBV, sure, of course, it can be defined as any act that's perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relations. So that's the definition that UNHCR used, and that's the one we sort of adapted for our study. Now, it is important to note that SGBV can be experienced by anyone, and this includes men and boys, but our research has predominantly focused on the experiences of women and girls, as they comprise the majority of SGBV survivors or victims globally, so that's where we've focused, but that's not to de-emphasize the importance of violence against men and boys. So breaking down what the term sexual and gender-based violence constitutes, it can take many forms, and that might include physical violence and sexual violence, which I think is what people most often think of or associate with the term. But it can also include verbal violence, so that includes threats, or psychological violence, including, intimidation, and also socioeconomic violence, which, for those not familiar, includes potentially the taking or controlling of someone's income, not allowing them to maintain sort of separate financial access and things like that. And given that we're talking about the mining sector and that we're going to be talking about women working in the mining sector, I think it's important to specifically emphasize sexual harassment as a form of sexual violence. So within the workplace, the ILO defines sexual harassment as an act including unwelcome or offensive behavior, which might take the form of a quid pro quo arrangement. So the implication of a promotion based on, for instance, a sexual favor, but it can also include a threatening work environment or a hostile work environment. And that might include something that perpetrators might not even realize is creating a hostile work environment. So uncomfortable jokes and comments and things like that. And I think it's important to emphasize this, as people do often associate SGBV with physical acts and not necessarily the verbal acts or non-physical ways that it can manifest. So in terms of how it manifests or links to the mining sector, I'd start by saying mining doesn't necessarily cause GBV, but it does have an exacerbating or amplifying effect on a community. I mean, there will be pre-existing inequalities or pre-existing levels of GBV in any given community, but the introduction of a mine or mining activity can have this sort of amplifying effect. So, for example, one of the main theories of that is the idea that by introducing mining to a community, it causes structural changes through the increase in cash flows. And there's the theory that by increasing cash flows into a community, this, for example, increases labor migration, or it increases cash, leading to an increase in alcohol consumption, which is thought to lead to then an attendant increase in domestic violence within the home. Now, these are certainly important issues, and that's one of the main theories around SGBV in the mining sector. but there does seem to be a tendency to influence or consider domestic violence when we're talking about SGBV, when actually it can take place at a variety of other forms and a variety of other levels and perpetrated by a variety of different peoples. So we have to lose sight of some of the more structural forms that might include violence perpetrated by state agents or security forces. So when we took on our research, the way we tried to organize the data and organize the findings and the evidence that we compiled was to look at women's different interactions with the sector, or the different domains, we called them, of interaction that women have. So we broke this down into women as large-scale mining employees, women as ASM workers, as Jen just highlighted, there are these different scales of the sector. And then women as members of affected communities. And then finally, women as activists or advocates holding companies and governments to. Now, it is worth noting there are obviously a lot of other ways in which people engage in the sector, but we sort of broke it down for ease of organization into these four that connect women spatially to the mine where the SGBV might take place. So through that, you do see the structural changes, and we did come across that in our research of mining leading to increased levels of domestic violence in the area. And there have been some interesting attempts to quantify that using demographic and health survey data. But you also see other forms. So within LSM mining, for instance, you see violence and sexual harassment within the workplace, and sometimes made conditional on access to employment or conditional upon access to benefits within the workplace. Within the ASM sector, you see requirement of sexual acts to access mine sites, and I know there's been a lot of research in the Great Lakes region around some of those manifestations. And then beyond women working in the mining sector, in turning more to the community dimensions, you do see the effect on domestic violence, but you also see the risks associated with the introduction of a new workforce into an area. So that might include mine security guards, for instance, or workers that are from a different area or from a different context. And that could be as, I don't want to use the word minor, but as relatively minor as verbal harassment or uncomfortable verbal comments, but has also been known to be as serious as rape of women by security guards. And that's been noted to have taken place, for instance, in the Pujera mine in Papua New Guinea. There's a lot of evidence there. And for instance, more recently, the North Mara mine in Tanzania, there was an investigation there that found out evidence of that. So that's something that's definitely happening and is a risk factor. And there is some quite prominent language on that in the gender responsive implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as a result. And then finally, for women as activists or community advocates, that's maybe at this stage a lesser explored area of SGBV, but there is evidence of gendered forms of harassment, intimidation used potentially to silence women who are opposing mines. And that what's concerning about that is that can be perpetrated by government institutions as well as by potentially by other community members. And there have been evidence compiled by AWID, the Association for Women in International Development, who noted that the slander of women or the threats of slandering women within their communities if they were outspoken about violence. So starting rumors of prostitution and things like that to discredit them within their own communities if they were speaking out. So that's a kind of form of verbal violence, and an example of why we do need to look at this beyond direct employment in the mining sector and beyond like physical acts of violence. So I hope I haven't taken up too much time, but that would be, I think, a summary of how we define it and how we, broadly speaking, saw it manifest.
Excellent. Really, really interesting. And I'm sure our participants will look forward to reading it. A quick question, can you go a little bit into more detail about the effects of sexual gender-based violence on sexual and reproductive health within these different groups? You alluded to large-scale mining and some of the differences in artisanal. Can you comment on sexual and reproductive health issues, impacts?
Sure, in terms of sexual and reproductive health, sure, that wasn't something we were explicitly looking at in this research, but I think one of the broader issues around sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector that we were looking at was, and what we saw as potentially kind of a driver of it or an enabling factor, was really the lack of much of an institutional response. So in terms of large-scale mining, an absence of potentially like properly equipped services that could necessarily respond to that, and that would include a sexual and reproductive health response. And then I think obviously in the ASM sector, and where you're far more knowledgeable than I am, you have, I think, the issues around supposedly protective legislation around pregnant women, trying to sort of keep them away from mining sites, ostensibly for their own protection, but in ways that tended to push them into potentially more risky roles in the mining sector, and the some links it has to child labour. And I think there's broader issues around the levels of informality and service access in certain ASM sites anyway that would also have links to sexual and reproductive health.
Good. We have a comment from one of our participants, a question. If you could, did your research look at types of violence faced by indigenous women in particular? And if there were differences between indigenous and non-indigenous women, and any differences between region that you found?
So in taking the latter half first, in between regions, the countries we looked at in the study were the DRC, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. And part of the logic of that was actually based in terms of networks to gather data and informants for this study. So that's not to say those countries are where the bulk of the violence is, or that other countries weren't included for any other particular reasons. I think that the point on indigeneity is really important, and I think, and beyond that, also including other factors like age and disability, other intersecting factors that might make someone more or less vulnerable. We didn't in this study specifically look at indigenous populations, but I think that's something that definitely needs to be covered and explored.
Good, okay. It's an area that needs more attention. We have another question on the issue of camps and camps being primarily dominated by men, and how this impacts women's rights in particular, and whether you're aware of any literature initiatives to address this. I think we'll probably have something from Adriana on this later.
Well, I'm sure Adriana will have a lot more to say on that, and we did, through some of our key informant interviews and through some of the literature that we covered, did look at the issue of risk factors around mining camps that included lack of access. And this was within the context of LSM mining, where women were relocating for work, but it did include a lack of access to separate changing facilities, the distance of the camp from the mine, and the lack of a safe route between the mine and the site where they were living, that left women more vulnerable and exposed to harassment, and that was particularly at night. So I think one of the drivers that we'd felt was the lack of a gendered approach in the sector anyway has this attendant consequence on SGBV, because, not to be glib, but some of these issues we found within camps and within LSM operations could be somewhat simply addressed just through sometimes the provision of appropriate PPE, for instance, or a separate changing facility, or sort of more child-friendly spaces if you had mothers that were breastfeeding that were in some more administrative roles, for instance. And so whilst there are these, I guess, broad norms around gender-based violence that can make it acceptable, and whilst the mining sector is is at least perceived to be a very male-dominated space, despite the fact that there are large numbers of women in ASM, and historically women have been involved in the mining sector in a variety of ways, I think sometimes this emphasis on the normative aspects, almost sometimes de-emphasized the lack of attention to sort of quite basic workplace health and safety issues that could be quite sort of easily adapted to be more supportive of women. Good,
very interesting. We have, just for our participants, we are keeping track of all of your questions. We do want to get to all of your questions. We'll have a bigger Q&A session at the end, so we are compiling and we'll do our best. Excellent, really exciting study and really important work. Thank you, Sophie. I know we'll be talking about it more in the broader Q&A towards the end of our webinar. But I think we'd like to jump to some really amazing concrete examples we have on the ground. I'd like to take us back to Emmanuel, to talk about the Golden Line project. And we hear about how Emmanuel and Golden Line can tell us about their experiences in working to prevent SGBV in artisanal small-scale mining, or ASM communities in particular. So welcome, Emmanuel. Can you tell us about your experiences?
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Golden Line is a 5-year program, which is geared towards social and economic empowerment of women living in artisanal and small-scale gold mining communities in Ghana and Tanzania. And we have 4 main blocks to address this. That is improve working conditions and positions of women in mines, improve access to and control of our resources, improve sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also more recognition of the importance of gender equality. And we are privileged to have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands supporting this program, led by Semavi Healthy Entrepreneurs Organization, and in Ghana by Presby Relief Services and the Hope for Future Generations. Now, so specifically, as part of the Golden Line program, what are the things that we adopted to address SGBV in these mining communities that we work with? We adopted 2 main methodologies, which the next slides will show. And the 2 main methodologies that we adopted basically are EASE, that is economic and social empowerment, which has 3 steps that we implemented. And the first steps is the formation of association known as the Village Savings and Loan concept, which we introduced in the communities meant for women in these communities that we engaged. And what we did was to create access to savings, loans, and emergency fund to support their activities, and also to build a social support network. And we have 9 to 12 month cycle for this kind of a concept that we introduced. And we also, the next step is to introduce the gender discussion series, where we managed to engage male household members to discuss and address gender inequalities and SGBV and financial planning activities in the household and the community level, and also creating space for women to safely voice out their priorities. And this consists of 8 sessions for this particular activity. Then the next step is the business skills training that we also introduce in these communities, which is geared towards creating skills and then knowledge training for these women associations, and also support their ongoing businesses. Now with the BST, we created opportunity to support these women to make good use of their savings, the resources that they have, so that they will have prudent financial and business management activities in their respective communities. Then linking to this is also another methodology that we introduced, focusing basically on both the women, but more importantly on the men, who are mostly the perpetrators. So we also introduced what we call EMAP session. And the EMAP session is engaging men in accountable practices in these communities, which has 2 curricula, the female curricula and then the male curricula. So the women curricula, basically we organize training on violence against women and girls, and they also discuss women's hopes and priorities for change. And this is 8 session activity that we organize for the women. Now, after this, you also engage the male actors on the priorities of women who are integrated into their curriculum, and we also address beliefs and practices, and then also behavioral change to prevent violence against women. And for the male counterpart, they had 16 sessions. Now, we recognize men, chiefs, and opinion leaders as agents of change in these communities. So we have to make sure that we engage them to address SGBV issues in these communities and also to reflect on harmful behaviors and gender inequality in the communities. That is the reason why we also link this to the initial methodology that we introduced. Now, the question we will ask is, as we introduce this to address SGBV in these mining communities, was it beneficial? Was it helpful? I would say, that's one to I would say, yes, it was beneficial. Because the men, and the next slide will indicate and will show that the men, the chiefs, the opinion leaders that we engaged in these communities became agents of change in these communities that we work in. They created awareness in the communities and also supported existing structures in the communities or the district level, which includes the domestic violence and victim support unit under the Ghana Police Service, and then the social welfare, and then the gender desk, to embark on awareness creation in the communities to be able to address some of these things that exist in their respective areas of jurisdiction. Again, we also have the mines, which has developed grievance mechanisms and which are addressing women issues, and the women also have confidential counselors which are appointed to support them in times of need. And we also experienced that several men who took part in the GDS and EMAP sessions are publicly on their own in their communities, faith-based institutions, through their community information systems, also highlighting the need to address SGBV in their respective communities and to support women to address their inequalities to also become meaningful persons in the community. So basically, these are some of the things that we've done and which is helping the communities that we work in the Western and Ashanti regions of Ghana. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Really, really exciting project. Just a quick question from the group. Do these men, are they facing challenges as being agents of change in their communities? What type of struggles are they facing as they're trying to influence other men and women, really? Are they facing challenges in these communities?
Yes, the women are facing challenges. You know, in Ghana, for instance, it's difficult for women to own assets, to own land and property. Mm-hmm. Yes, so that if you don't address this kind of challenges, we don't address these systems, the structures, the norms in these communities, it means that it's difficult for women to be economically empowered. So there's the need, therefore, to engage the main actors, which are the chiefs, the opinion leaders, and other, the male, to address this challenge, to create assets for women, to also engage in meaningful economic venture, to support household income, and to support the community development.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Emmanuel. We'll come back to you shortly, but we want to hear about another intervention, other grassroots projects to address SGBV in the mining sector. So we'll jump over to Fatima from Makua, who's going to talk to us. Fatima, what strategies have you used to address SGBV? What are you doing to mobilize stronger commitments to combat SGB in the communities where you're working?
Okay, hi
everyone.
everyone.
You can turn your camera on. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, we see you now.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Apologies, I've been having so many technical issues today. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. So, as was mentioned, I am Fatima Valley. I am an activist and member of two movements called Women Affected by Mining United in Action and Mining Affected Communities United in Action. So just because it's a mouthful, I'll refer to them for the rest of the discussion as Makua and Wamua. The movements were formed in 2012 as a response to the Marikana massacre, when 34 mine workers were shot down by the South African police services because they were demanding a living wage. So the movements were formed because the very real and urgent need to shape an alternative counterpower structure to contend with very toxic and very crude alliance that exists between mining companies and the government. The movement's primary aim is establishing a bottom-up democratic structure that centralizes communities and builds solidarity across struggles and geographies, strengthening the agency and determination of mining-affected communities, especially women, to effect the changes necessary to reorganize the sector. As Sophie mentioned and Emmanuel alluded to, women, particularly those living in mining-affected communities, are still forced to carry the costs of very exploitative laws and policies. It's very sad that within the era of a democratic South Africa, this is still the reality. Women's voices are still excluded when policy and legislation is developed, unless it's in a very piecemeal, superficial tick box exercise, which is not what we're talking about. We're talking about substantive consent and deliberation with women, where their voices are encapsulated in the policies. The daily struggle for land, water, food, economic independence, and bodily sovereignty continues to be at the heart of Black women's struggles in marginalized mining communities. This layered, complicated, and entangled forms of violence is pervasive across all institutions in society, from the home to school to the community to the state. The consequence of which is that women are locked further and more deeply into systems that engineer their oppression, violates women's rights, and reproduces and entrenches gender inequality. The mining and extractive industry in South Africa remains an important economic driver. Yet, 26 years into democracy, it still continues to be a site of massive oppression for women. In a baseline audit, which was conducted by Wamua, Makua, and Action Aid in 2018, the quantified findings linked to the gendered impacts of mining, unfortunately, were unsurprising, right, considering the gross gender-based violence prevalent within the country. So let's just go through some of these key findings and statistics. 40% of women indicated that jobs in the mines, which are located on their doorsteps, are only accessible through sexual favors. 73% of women indicated that they had received no benefits from the mine. All of the women indicated that the community experiences substantial amounts of violence, such as rape, murder, and abuse. 85% of women linked the increase in violence to the development of mining. So let's just go through that one more time. You've got a very pervasive level of gender-based violence in mining-affected communities. 85% of women are saying that the increase of this violence is directly related to the mine. And this, to some extent, if I understood correctly from Sophie, kind of mirrors the research that the findings that she had found in her research around how mining activities exacerbate and can be a driver towards increasing different forms of violence against women. The state's role becomes very important in trying to disrupt these cycles. But within South Africa, the state's endeavors to try and redress and substantially transform the sector has been quite poor. Now, given that the mining and extractive industry is predicated on a very patriarchal, exploitative, and historically entrenched unequal social and economic relations, it's little wonder then that the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, MPRTA, which governs the acquisition, use, and disposal of mineral rights within South Africa, pays significant attention to the broad category of historically disadvantaged persons. But women and women-specific issues are omitted for special consideration in the main act. So simply put, there is no political will to break down the pervasive structures and practices of patriarchy that continues to condemn women to poverty, exclusion, and abuse. As long as women remain on the margins of consultation and decision-making processes, the gender bias and pro-elite bias in the benefits and cost of the extractive projects will not be adequately addressed and will continue to disproportionately oppress and abuse rural working class women. So just a very quick example in my closing about envisioning a real tangible alternative that is rooted from a bottom-up approach. Makua, Wamua, and Action Aid during 2005 and 2016 worked with mining-affected communities across the country, gathering the mandate of communities and engage with over 150 communities at a local level across mining areas to understand what would be the key principles that would need to shape the refashioning of a mining sector that actually meets the needs of marginalized communities, serves the needs of all South Africans, not just a few elite transnational corporations and institutions like the World Bank, but serves the people on which land these minerals are being exploited. From this endeavor, the People's Mining Charter was born, and it is used as the key advocacy tool that Wamua and Makua basically advocate for. And Wamua's key demand is very simple and very clear. Women must have the right to inherit land, should be consulted on all issues affecting their bodies, families, land, lives, both in terms of a customary traditional structure and community, local, provincial, and national structures. And when we talk about consultation, we're talking about meaningful consultation and meaningful consent. Nothing about women without women. I think I'll stop there and wait for some additional Q&As.
Excellent. Wow, that's a mind-blowing statement, and definitely I think all of our participants would agree. We do have a question. You talked about lack of political will and lack of requirements to ensure that consultation and engagement is gender responsive, to ensure it's not just a tick box. We have a question from our group about, do we know about any examples of gender responsive mining law, for example, that's compelling, not just compelling, but obligating companies and governments to act in a certain way? Do we have any positive examples in Africa that you could point us to?
I mean, I can talk about the South African context where the mining charter was meant to be a vehicle by which the sector would be redressed. But again, here it falls short. And where government and mining companies fall flat is that the communities that are directly impacted and are never at the negotiating table. And so I can't think of any example within the South African context where it has been beneficial. The only positive tool that I think does exist within our context is the People's Mining Charter, because it has been driven by mining communities. In all engagements that we've been involved with mining companies and the Department of Mineral Resources, it is one based on placating the anger and frustrations of communities with empty promises and empty compromises. But at the end of the day, nothing has substantially changed. And the reality is, if things don't change, we are probably looking at more and more situations like Marikana, where you have such a great level of social unrest because of the degrees of inequality, So it's a matter of urgency. It's no longer a question of when government is going to do it. It's a question of it has to be done, and it has to be led by mining affected communities in the reshaping of a mining paradigm, specifically women who bear the costs of mining operations. And yeah, so unfortunately, I can't think of any positive engagements or tools that have been used in South Africa.
Okay. It seems there's a new generation of mining laws coming about requiring community development agreements that are quite specific in terms of local engagements. I don't know if the laws or the regulations that follow are that specific and ensuring that engagement is meaningful and inclusive. I think those countries that are in the process of developing those now can learn a lot from what you're saying. You know, if we know this is a gap, we know this is an issue. If we're developing new laws and regulations now, let's make sure it's included and required as a way forward, among other strategies. You know, we started with Emmanuel hearing about changing mindsets. Now we're hearing nuts and bolts of what needs to happen at a broader level. We'll come back to you, Fatima. We do actually have quite a few questions for you, but we'll come back in the Q&A session. And now we'll jump to Adriana Aftimi from IFC, who's had an extensive focus on gender-based violence in mines and mining communities or mining companies for years, and has done some amazing work. And Adriana, what strategies are you promoting now? We want to hear about your strategies and to what effect. And can you in particular share some good practice, good examples that we can all learn from going forward? So welcome, Adriana.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome to all the participants. I'm changing a little bit the subject from the community level and then come back to the mining companies and what they can do and what are the tools and strategies which are available. In our work, we are looking mostly from the cost of gender-based violence. With regards to on-site sexual harassment, with a study of the Fortune 500 companies estimated that the cost of the sexual harassment in the workforce, it's around at 6.7 million a year in terms of absenteeism, low productivity, and employee turnover. And we also work in many countries and looking at the cost of the off-site violence. Like, for example, according to the PNG Business Coalition for Women, intimate partner violence causes employees to miss about 11 days of work per year on average, either to take care of themselves or taking care of others, which means a lost work time totaling of about 10% of the company's annual wages. That is why the mining companies are paying more and more attention to put in place a series of changes to better support employees who have experienced gender-based violence, such as, for example, Rio Tinto, they put in place a measure of extra paid leave or short-term financial assistance or emergency housing and support and counseling services through the company. And for that, their efforts were internationally recognized through receiving the White Ribbon accreditation for the operations in Australia in 2018. So to help companies and to have them addressing gender in general and gender-based violence in particular around their workforce, we put together the gender toolkit, and basically it's a box with 5 books, each book being addressed to a different function of the company. The introduction and the executive summary is basically for the CEOs to learn about what is the business case for gender and why they should start doing. Should start addressing gender in a more systematic and structured way. The first tool suite, it's related to increasing gender diversity from the workforce to the boardroom. then women-owned businesses and supply chain, women and communities, and then addressing gender-based violence in the workforce. And each of these tool suites basically looks at assess and prepare, address and monitor and sustain. The tools themselves and the strategies are are very varied, and they can be checklists or audits or model policies and TORs. Next slide, please. Just to focus on the tool suite 4, which is about addressing gender-based violence in the workforce. Basically, what we are intending to, when we put together this, it was based on a demand from the companies saying, yes, we understand why we need to address this. We understand, we don't know the how, basically. And so this part, this tool suite basically brings together some tools that prove to be very efficient on the ground, like helping putting together, helping getting the right resources to address gender-based violence, because you cannot, you need, as a company, you need to have somebody specialized to do that. So that is why one of the tools that we put in the assess and prepare is the TOR for sexual harassment and gender-based violence baseline. And also they said, okay, we now have the baseline, we now understand what is the problem, but how we are addressing. And in many cases, we've noticed that the companies are lacking the right policies and procedures in place. So the tools that we put together are basically helping to do that. For the time being, we have experience in working in various countries with companies, particularly helping them to prepare code of conduct for their contractors on the ground when they do construction in particular, because most of the cases are happening at that time, and also having policies in place like sexual harassment policies or even gender-based violence awareness campaigns that are focused both internally and externally in the communities. We found very useful to have the trainings and the awareness being regularly taking place, and also working very closely with the contractors, and as well with organization, community-based organization to help the company partner with them and help them address the issues. What we found very important also is training of the people who are directly involved in responding to gender-based violence allegations, and having in place systems like reporting system, grievance mechanisms that specifically give people the confidentiality and also the support of reporting these cases, because in many, what we've noticed in many places, people, women in particular, are afraid to report such cases, and we want to encourage them to report. And for that, we addressing the issues and basically working with them and giving them the proper support. It needs trained people and people who are very well prepared. I can talk more about it, and I'm happy to respond to questions if any right now, and happy to continue the discussion.
We do have quite a few questions. One that keeps coming up is about supply chains. Now, you talked about contractors, and when we think of the supply chain, we have upstream of the mine and lateral to the mine. who's providing services, goods, inputs to the mine. And then we also have downstream. Have you looked additionally at some of downstream strategies? Are there standards or certification type schemes? Are there things emerging that also look at the downstream as well as upstream?
So it's the tools that we develop are now developed specifically for oil, gas, and mining companies, the upstream. But we are in the process of revising the toolkit and basically look also at infrastructure in general and basically tackling on the downstream. And we are also working more and more at the community level, basically identifying service providers and potential partners to the companies. And when I'm saying companies, I'm talking about the whole range. You know, when we talk about mining, we also talk about roads. We also talk about power and all of they can be contractors or they can be partners to the mine. So yes, we are taking a more holistic approach at the infrastructure level.
That's excellent, because the multiplier effect can be huge when we start looking at all those linkages.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know for me, I've used your tools. We're using your tools, and the issue of contractors is a big one. One final comment. I mean, we've heard a lot about Fatima's experiences, and I still keep going back to Emmanuel talking about changing mindsets of men as well as women. Are you finding some success in actually seeing a change in mindset and seeing positive outcomes from people using these, introducing them in their companies?
It takes time. That's for sure. What I've seen in one of our projects where we actually have had a very big internal awareness campaign about SGBV, using videos and using, you know, talking about what type of harassment sexual harassment can be, even just joking about the woman looks or making addressing, you know, making comments on their look and so on. And what we used in the campaign, which was very effective actually to change mindsets, was addressing to men and saying, would you do this to your mother or to your sister? And that was like really a turning point in people understanding that if they do this to a colleague, it may happen to their family, and for them that was very important. So I think that changing behaviors and changing mindsets starts first with people understanding very well and having internalizing what this can be, and basically, as Emmanuel said, also, you know, you have to work with everybody. It's not just enough to work with women and help them. Men has to be at the table too.
Great. Thank you very much.
And one more point. It's very important that the company itself, where the CEO was the one who pushes it worked very well.
Yeah, that's good. That's really important. You need leadership to transform also. So
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. We will come back to you. We have a lot of questions actually evolving and coming to our on our list of growing questions. Now I want to go to each of you just for 2 minutes each. Going back to Emmanuel, we are in an unprecedented time with COVID-19. Since February, the world has transformed, and globally, gender inequalities have been growing, and issues of gender-based violence, domestic violence are essentially in the media almost every day. Emmanuel, can you tell us how have you adapted your strategies to address gender-based violence in this crazy time?
Thank you very much. Pandemics such as COVID-19 compounds prevailing inequalities and abuse. And mostly the most affected are the vulnerable women and the girls. And with the COVID-19, there's interruption of sources of income for especially the household needs. The breadwinners are affected, which increases their stress. And as it increases their stress, it may translate to heightened tension and leading to violence. So there's therefore the need as part of the Golden Line program to integrate SGBV prevention measures and also to address the COVID-19 response mechanism, as we also put in place the various protocols. So what we have done so far is that we organize COVID-19 training as part of activities addressing SGBV issues. So as we organize the training, we also organize training on SGBV alongside for our women facilitators, women ambassadors in the communities, chiefs, opinion leaders, and existing structures, that is the social welfare, the gender desk, the National Commission for Civic Education, and then the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit. So we brought all of them together to build their capacity to be able to respond accordingly and to also organize sensitization activities in the respective districts that we work in. Then we also join them at the same time to disseminate messages on SGBV in the context of COVID-19 through social media, radio, and community outreach activities. So that at least because of the lockdown situations, now children are at home, some have lost their livelihood, women and their spouses, some have lost their livelihoods, mostly household heads. And because we know this may increase the risk of SGBV, then there's the need for us to take the message to them as part of our strategy to at least reduce, if not curb this, reduce the impact of SGBV in these communities. Now, the lesson learned here is that because of the impact, marginalized families are most affected by both the financial and psychological burden caused by the COVID-19. So there's therefore extra effort for us to link those who have lost their livelihood to existing systems or practices in place put up by the government in their respective districts. So we started with our VSLA groups to linking them to the social intervention through the National Board for Small Scale Industry to access grants and social intervention programs the government has put in place to at least cushion them to bounce back to life. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a really good example, using the existing structures and networks to link. And it's also really reassuring to hear that governments is also providing support to artisanal small scale miners and your groups, hopefully in particular. Maybe we'll go to Fatima. Fatima, can you just briefly highlight how you've adapted your strategies in this time?
So Makua and Wamua have over 30 branches across 7 provinces in the country. So with the advent of COVID-19, Wamua and Makua were acutely aware of the profound impact this would have on communities and how far-reaching this would be specifically for women who would ultimately shoulder a need to buffer, needless to say, without recognition and due compensation, the impact of the pandemic. The branches then resolved that an immediate short-term strategy to manage the impact was to map who the most vulnerable in the community, both in terms of physiological preconditions and socioeconomic factors. The branches then distributed food parcels to households and essential packs to women. The essential packs included sanitary pads, sanitizers, and other essential items for women. When what became painfully clear through each distribution was the multiple layers of pressure mounted on women in the household. So it became very clear that COVID-19, and I think you said it quite well, Jennifer, is a gendered crisis. While the virus in and of itself does not discriminate, existing systemic inequalities prejudice women and marginalized mining communities. So during the distributions, we then thought it would be important to understand what women's experiences were in the household. So when we were distributing the dignity packs, as it was called, we asked women several questions, like what were the primary challenges that they faced? Has these challenges been aggravated by COVID-19? Have you or anyone in the household experienced gender-based violence during the lockdown? And we talked about issues around household food security. And what we found from the preliminary assessment of those questionnaires is that there appears to be, and I think Emmanuel alluded to this as well, a trend wherein in some instances where an inequality and a form of discrimination predates the pandemic, this condition is exacerbated by the onset of COVID-19. So while government has responded, again, it has not been the most effective, particularly when it comes to factors of gender-based violence, because we had a very hard lockdown where women were locked with partners who were potentially violent to them. So what WMOA did as a form of after mapping what the situation was, we formed, part of different national coalitions to see how we could support women who were reporting forms of gender-based violence. And this was either by, extracting them and putting them in safe homes, alternatively where there was prejudice, whether at the police station or in the home, there were forms of solidarity where the branches would go to the police station or to the court to ensure that there was some form of justice and solidarity with the woman. But again, I think that because communities were not effectively consulted during the process, and I mean, it's an interesting one when it comes to COVID-19, a lot of the repercussions of how decisions got made will be shouldered on the communities, and I think we'll be seeing that for a ways to come as we continue to feel the economic impacts. So that's just in a nutshell.
That's a big nut. But I'm just very impressed, and I think we've all just learned a lot about what we could and should be doing, I think, in our own roles in communities and organizations. Really, really amazing, these efforts. Adriana, how have your strategies adapted in this situation?
So we basically started working at 3 levels. One level was basically working with local responders to ensure that key support services such as helplines or shelters or medical facilities and legal aid remain available. They are open and free at point of use for those that need them. The second level was working with our clients, the companies who do not already have GBV policies or guidelines in place, and engage experts to help develop a suitable response framework, including key messages for employees. That was complemented by awareness campaigns around COVID inside and outside, inside the company for the workers and outside for the communities. The third level, and this is based exactly on what Fatima and Emmanuel talked about, the gender exacerbated by the lockdown and then the COVID. And we heard from Sophie that poverty, it's one of the drivers that leads to gender-based violence. So the third level, what we did, we put in place programs to help girls and women in the communities to get some income during this period when jobs and income is very hard to get. And we train them to make PPEs and like masks and soap, which can then be sold to the companies and also to the communities. So in that way, helping them to cope with the COVID and have the necessary supplies and also getting some income, which we see as a protection against gender-based violence. So we had these programs in Guinea, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone so far, and also working with other companies, clients in other parts of the world.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like in all three cases, what you're doing is, what you have been doing becomes a platform to address, these other challenges.
Yeah.
We are going to jump into a bigger Q&A. We've collected 5,020,000 questions, but we'll start with just a few. But Adriana, while I have you with me, people are asking about whether companies are readily accepting to participate in these programs. Is this, addressing SGBV? Is it like a tick boxing thing, or is it something that's brought to them and then there's pressure, or are they accepting this? And maybe even an added level of that question, I would see.
Sorry, I was for 2 seconds interrupted at the beginning of your question.
That's okay.
Can you?
Yeah, we have, say there's a large company, and then at that company has different mines and operations. A company may be wanting to participate in this. What sort of traction are you getting, say at the mine site level, and are people participating willingly? Are they ready to accept SGBV training and ensuring contractors are compliant,
so
etc.?
most of the time when I'm engaging with a client, with a company, what I'm hearing when I talk about trying to find out more about gender-based violence or sexual harassment cases, they all are saying we don't have any. So we don't have this problem. And it takes a little bit of time to just work with them and explain what gender-based violence is and what sexual harassment is. And most of the time, definitely they get it, and they are willing to improve the reporting and to improve the policies what they have in place, because for them it's a business case. And I talked a little bit about the cost of gender-based violence in terms of absenteeism and turnover of the employees, and also for the social license to operate. So for them, it's a business case. And then, yes, when they understand that this is a business case, they are willing to participate. Not
okay.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I'm just looking at time. We have 6 minutes before we all get cut off. I wish we could go another hour. I think I'll jump to Emmanuel now. I mean, can you talk about an example of any surprising strategies that emerged through your work, things that you learned that you didn't talk about that actually surprised you and you didn't expect as emerging as an important strategy to combat SGBV? I know your program was designed amazingly, and all of the aspects of it are learning lessons for all of us. But what is something you learned from the ground that we can take away?
Yeah, we are enthused about the support, the massive support that we have received from key actors, especially chiefs and opinion leaders, and then the main actors that the main agents of change in these communities. You know, in Ghana, because of our cultural practices, the norms and the systems, as I indicated earlier, it is not easy to change the status quo. And because the men think that they are the head of the family. So if it comes to any form of employment or contributing to household income, they should be the lead. They must own assets, they must own property and not the woman. But through this program, we've realized that we have a big push from these men, even chiefs who are campaigning for the status quo to be changed in the communities, which is a very good lesson learned that we can also adopt for other communities in Ghana and elsewhere. And we're looking at how even women are supported and now supported by their male counterparts, coming together to plan together, to raising together, involving them in decision-making process, both at home and in the communities, giving opportunities for women to also contribute to the socioeconomic development of their respective communities. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. One final question for Fatima. We're getting a lot of questions about the People's Charter. Can you quickly tell us how this came about, and whether it's codified? Like, is it a legal requirement now to comply with the Charter?
Hopefully soon it will become codified. That's wishful thinking. So as was mentioned, in 2015 and 2016, Makua, Wamoa, and ActionAid went through a very intensive process, working with other civil society players in South Africa to understand what the key issues in the sector were, and what were the principles or the guidelines that would help us re-envision the one that would be rooted from the bottom up. So getting the input from communities that are directly impacted by mining, how would they shape an alternative, or what would be the key principles for which to redesign a mining sector that in fact represents the needs of communities, and that the benefits from the mineral resources are actually reaped by the communities and South Africa as a whole, beyond corruption and so forth. So what then happened was that a collective of community members came to Johannesburg together with these different stakeholders and basically looked at key principles, key areas of gaps within the policies, in the mining legislation and environment in South Africa, and then went to communities, over 150 communities, as I mentioned, across South Africa, to engage, to say, look, these were the gaps that were found examining the legislation and, the MPRDA, as I mentioned, the mining charter. What is it that we need to do to either address the gap, or do we need to completely revision the mining sector? And through this very consultative and participatory process that was fundamentally led by communities, the People Mining Charter was born. It was comprised of 10 key principles and guidelines, and because of time constraints, I won't go into all of them, Jennifer, but it is available for people to look at on our website, and it's online. Yeah. So makua.org.za, and you'll find the charter. And it's, sorry.
Wonderful. I have a feeling we may get cut off in 1 minute. I'm not sure how this works. I'm going to give Sophie a final comment, a key takeaway, but all of our slides will be shared with you via email. You can also go to womenandmining.org to get more information. And at the end of these slides, we have a number of references and resources. And I know the people that participated today probably would love to hear more from you. Thank you, everyone, our amazing team, Samavi, Solidaridad, Kit, everyone involved. Sophie, can you take us away? We may be able to keep going on, we're not sure. You have 15 seconds.
Oh, wow.
And thank you to everybody.
Well, yeah, indeed. Thank you very much to everybody. And I think if I was to give one key takeaway from, I think, the research that we've done is really the, I think cross-cutting across sort of all aspects of the sector and all the different actors and the ways that people can interact with the sector is probably the issue of power relations when it comes to SGBV, and whether that's between men and women, between employers and employees, between a government and a host government and a company, or between companies and activists. I think the mining sector is one of the sectors most marked by vast power differentials when it comes to SGBV. And I know one of the questions I saw in the Q&A was about push and pull factors. And I think relative power, not to be too wordy, but is probably one of the major ones. And I think there's a bit more of that in the report to unpack there. But with what I imagine is 2 seconds remaining, I won't go into it now.
We fortunately haven't been cut off yet. I think they've shared the link to womeninmining.org. Our participants, this was amazing. Panelists, thank you so much. You're all heroes. We're all working, I think, together in the right direction. And I think next time we need to organize this thing to be at least 2 hours long, if not 2.5 hours long.
Yes.
But thank you, everyone. Wish you a
Thank
lovely
you.
day. Stay
Thank you
healthy,
too.
wear your mask, follow the rules.
Yes. Use the soap.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Use the soap. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you. Bye-bye.
everyone.